So today what we're going to do is practice some source skills for the compulsory question on component 2 of the AQA A-level history course, Britain 1951 to 2007. And we're going to use the 1984 to 1985 miners' strike to highlight some source skills and practice them. So as you can see in front of you, you've got a question from one of the exam papers a couple of years ago about the miners' strike, and you're being asked to use this source and your own knowledge to assess the value of this source to a historian studying the reasons for the 1984 to 85 miners' strike. So in a way, you've got to take the position of you being a historian. You're writing a book about the miners' strike, specifically the reasons for it, why it happened, and you're assessing how useful this source is to you if you are writing that book about the reasons for the 84 to 85 miners' strike. That's the first thing to notice is the tail end of the question here. You will get a lot of students who will just see this as, all right, is this useful for the miners' strike? Well, it's not asking for that. It's asking you for whether this source is useful for the reasons for the miners' strike. So we're looking for causation here. And you need to be very careful about that aspect. You must focus on exactly what the examiner is after in these questions. Don't generalise according to topic. Now, you might want to pause and read this through, but source A, there are certain things we need to do here to assess its value to us. And you should know this by now. You've got to consider the provenance of the source. You've got to consider the content of it. You've got to use your own knowledge to assess both the provenance and the content. And if required, also you need to perhaps think about the tone or the language that is used in the source. If that helps you assess the value to a historian looking for reasons of the miners' strike. One thing to bear in mind is you will always have to comment about the provenance. You will always have to use the content and your own knowledge. Tone and language, the way it is gotten across, the tone, the words chosen, the language, do not have to be used in every single source on this paper. You get 3 sources on this compulsory question. But it may be that there is nothing really to say about whether the tone of a source affects the value on particular sources. So that is something that is optional. You should look for it, but if there's more to say about the provenance, talk about the provenance. You do not have to talk about the tone or the language unless it's clear that there is something about the tone of the language that helps you assess value for the means of the question. So if we just have a look at this, there are certain things here. Again, you might want to pause it and take your time over this. You've got 20 minutes really to do this in the exam. 3 sources, an hour, so 20 minutes. And I think it's important that out of that 20 minutes, you spend the first 5 minutes thinking carefully about a source, having a good study of it, and then you spend 15 minutes writing. And the examiners are not after a massive long essay here. They're after nice, tight points that relate to value. And this is one of the skills here, is that you've got to learn to get your points across in a concise, shorter way than sometimes you guys do, where you go on and explain things really, really, really thoroughly. You haven't got the time to do that on the question, so you do need to practice that idea of writing concise answers, of saying things sharply rather than exponentially going on about things. So let's have a look. The first thing that strikes me about this source is its provenance. You can say plenty here about the provenance of this source. It is useful. It's highly useful. This is a speech by Arthur Scargill. Now, I'm going to use my own knowledge here to say that Scargill was the leader of the NUM during this period and controversial leader of the NUM. And therefore, that's going to be valuable to us as a historian looking at the reasons for the miners' strike, because he is obviously the leader of the union that called the strike in the first place. So what he's got to say on this is useful. You do have to bear in mind, however, that this is being said, it's a speech being given at a commemoration of the 25th anniversary of the miners' strike, and therefore, you know, he's got a particular audience, and there may be some exaggeration in this. It will give a reasonably one-sided viewpoint as to the reasons as well, and you will see this in the tone and the language. You know, for example, you don't get anywhere by compromising with the capitalist class who are utterly ruthless, and it talks about fighting back and defying laws if they're unjust. So in a way, this reduces its value a little bit because of the actual event that Scargill is at when he's giving this speech. He's talking to a home crowd. He's perhaps exaggerating things. He's founded the Socialist Labour Party, so he's speaking to a socialist audience who like to hear about capitalism being evil, that sort of stuff. So that does take away from the source a little bit. We'll talk more a little bit later about provenance and some of the traps you might fall into in terms of bias and simplistic black or white reactions to provenance. But some of you may be thinking, well, there's more about provenance. I could say this, I could say this. Yes, you probably could, but you've only got 15 minutes here. So you can't talk about provenance all day long. You also have to realise that there are some sources where you can talk about provenance a lot, and some way you only need to talk about provenance a little bit. You don't have to talk about provenance for the same amount of time or the same amount of writing in every single source. So just bear that in mind, that some sources will allow you to discuss provenance at great length. This is probably a good example. But there are others where it's more a case of you focusing on the content of the source. Yeah. Now, in terms of the content of the source, I mean, it's quite clear that, you know, this is the whole message of the source, is that it was the Conservatives' fault. They started it. They created the strike. I'm using quotes here. It was political. We had no option. We had no choice here. And if you look through it, it's that idea that the Conservative government reneged on their agreement, and the government wasn't willing to listen, wasn't willing to be consulted. So that's quite useful for us. That's quite valuable because it shows us the viewpoint, as one-sided as it may be in terms of provenance, how Scargill and the unions felt. Remember that not all the unions and workers felt this way too. So this is where my own knowledge comes in, that Scargill was a controversial leader of the miners, and there were miners, for example, in Nottinghamshire who broke away and formed their own union because they didn't like the way in which Scargill and the NUM were taking on the government here, and some of their feelings and their methods. But there is some of this that rings true. I mean, in terms of my own knowledge, I do know that the Thatcher government were keen to privatise industries at the time, and were keen on making the economic case for pit closures. I do know that they'd been planning this for some time. I know that the government was worried about the miners. The Conservative government had been brought down by the miners before, back in Edward Heath days in the early 1970s. So, as well as that, there is some intransigence there. You look at Mrs. Thatcher's personality. You look at Ian McGregor, who was in charge of the coal board at the time, who was quite a cold business character. And there is some supporting evidence here, which makes, as a result, this more accurate and therefore of value. It is not to be dismissed purely because this is Arthur Scargill's viewpoint. Actually, there are things about this that resonate and ring true. There are some things that don't in the content. The idea that clean coal technology was around at the time isn't necessarily the case. And I'm not so sure that coal would have been supplying all the energy needs of Britain, because things had moved on a little bit by then and nuclear power was developing, and there were other means of sourcing resources for power stations at the time. So it perhaps is a little bit exaggerated in that way. In terms of the tone and the language, well, we've already mentioned that a little bit. This is very passionate, but then again, you could argue that that's less useful to us because obviously there's emotion in there, and Scargill is exaggerating things, and all this talk of capitalist class being utterly ruthless is a little bit over the top, perhaps, in terms of language. But the passion does give us an insight into how some of the miners felt, how the NUM leadership felt about what was going on here, that they were being treated unfairly, and they were fighting for their jobs and their industry against a government that was keen to subdue it and close pits. So there are some things that you could say there. Overall, and you do need some sort of summary in conclusion just to round things off here. Overall, I would say that this is a very useful source because it is from the leader of the NUM, and although perhaps some of the tone and the language is a little bit exaggerated for the audience he's speaking to, this gives you a good insight. This is valuable to historians looking for the reasons for the miners' strike, because it does suggest that feeling of the miners having to fight for their industry against a government that was keen to close parts of the industry down for economic reasons. Now, there's probably more you could talk about. There's probably other things that you've spotted here, but you've only got 15 minutes writing time here, so you need to touch on these things as quickly as possible and move on. So again, on this slide in front of you, you might want to just pause and stop a little bit. There are just some reminders here. Everything must be related to value is the first point. Okay, so you can't talk about provenance and then leave it. Does the points you made about provenance, do they make this source more valuable or less valuable to a historian looking for why the miners' strike happened during this period? As well as that, some of you probably need to practice your provenance. There is a tendency for the weaker students to just sort of dismiss things. So, for example, Scargill said this, he's biased, can't be trusted, it's less valuable. Well, you need to be a little bit warmer towards provenance here, a little bit. The sources that you're given are going to be useful. This is by Arthur Scargill. You can't be dismissive of it. This guy was there at the forefront of the miners' strike. So you do need to focus perhaps a little bit on the actual interpretation, the source that's been put in front of you, Scargill's interpretation of what was going on, and look at what you can learn. What is there that's valuable? That maybe it's the way he speaks, maybe it's things that are said. There are what uses can you make of this? Don't just write things off just because they appear to be biased at face value. Again, you've got some idea about tone again there a little bit in the third paragraph about Scargill's anger and bitterness about what happened and the emotions. And then finally, just a little comment just to remind you about contextual knowledge. And one final point here is that your questions on the compulsory question will be very narrow in terms of, Well, this is the depth study. Out of all the years you've studied, this is about the miners' strike. Now, if you haven't learnt about the miners' strike in your studies, then you're going to struggle to do the compulsory question to give own knowledge here. So this is a reminder that you need to know your content, your topics really thoroughly, because the examiners may pick something that is an event or something quite narrow, and if you don't know about that event, you're going to struggle a little bit in terms of deploying your own knowledge to help you answer the question. So there is no shortage of for the fact that if you want a high grade, you've got to know your topics really, really, really well. And all of them, you can't sort of skim through and just learn certain things on this course. It is a depth study. And you might like a go now at source B, which is in front of you. Hopefully you can do it in 20 minutes. Hopefully you can make some nice, precise and concise comments here about how this source from Mrs. Thatcher's autobiography helps assess the value of this source to historians studying the reasons for the 84 to 85 miners' strike. So have a go at this yourself, but please try and do this in the 20 minutes you will be given in the exam.